Duke Alistair Ravenscroft grabbed Eliza by her hair and dragged her across the marble ballroom floor toward the open rain. The gasps of the gathered nobility echoed as Eliza's silk gown shredded against the stone. In a single night, her name is erased from the ledger, her inheritance is forfeited to a lecherous earl, and she is branded a social leper. By morning, no household in the kingdom will hire her, and no soul will dare offer her a crust of bread. The Duke stood over her, his boots treading on her ruined hem as he signaled the guards to bar the massive oak doors. He looked at the shivering commoner, Adrian, and spat at his feet before the entire court. You chose a beggar over a crown, so you shall rot in the mud with him where you belong. A heavy, rhythmic thud silenced the Duke's laughter as the back of a golden gauntlet shattered the door's latch from the outside. A man in a midnight blue military uniform stepped into the light, ignoring the Duke's guards and the protocol of the court as if they were invisible insects. He didn't look at the Duke. He walked straight into the rain, knelt in the filth, and pressed a signet ring with the king's private seal into Eliza's trembling hand. But as Adrian stood to face the room, the Duke realized that the man he had just spat upon held the power to hang him for treason. If Eliza speaks the word, her father's life ends tonight, but can she survive the war that declaring her husband's true identity will spark across the empire? The heavy oak doors of Ravenscroft Manor groaned on their hinges, the sound of the shattered latch echoing like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. The Duke's laughter didn't just stop, it died in his throat, replaced by a wet, choking sound as he stared at the man in the doorway. The gathered gentry stood frozen, their wine glasses suspended midair, their faces pale masks of confusion and mounting dread. No one moved to stop the man in the midnight blue uniform as he strode across the floor, his boots clicking with a rhythmic, lethal precision against the marble. Eliza remained on her knees, the cold rainwater from the open door soaking into her ruined silk gown. She looked at the golden gauntlet and the man who wore it, but she did not feel the warmth of a rescue. She felt the crushing weight of a new, unknown terror. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes darting from her father's twitching hands to the heavy signet ring now pressed into her palm. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the scent of ozone and the sudden, overwhelming aura of a predator who had finally stopped playing a game. Every pair of eyes in the room was a needle, stitching her to the floor in a display of public shame that had only just begun to transform into something far more dangerous. She gripped the ring so hard the metal bit into her skin, wondering if she had simply traded one cage for another. Inside Eliza's mind, the world was a blur of grey shadows and the stinging memory of her father's palm against her cheek. She was no longer Lady Eliza Ravenscroft. She was a ghost, a nameless thing stripped of her history and her future in a single, violent hour. The betrayal burned deeper than the physical bruises forming on her arms where the Duke had dragged her. She had spent 20 years trying to earn the love of a man who viewed her only as a bargaining chip for a failing estate. Now, looking at the common soldier she had agreed to marry in secret, she felt a sickening wave of distrust wash over her. Adrian had told her he was a man of no rank, a simple blade for hire who would take her away from this golden prison. The weight of the signet ring in her hand told a different story, a story of lies, of hidden identities, and of a power that could incinerate everything she had ever known. If he had lied about his name, what else had he lied about? The social consequences of this moment were already spiraling beyond her control, and she realized with a jolt of fear that she had no home to return to and no identity to claim. She was a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, and the man reaching out to save her was the same man who had pushed her into the abyss of this mystery. Duke Alistair recovered his voice, though it came out as a jagged, ugly rasp that betrayed his internal panic. "Who do you think you are, breaking into my home and touching my property?" he spat, stepping forward with his fist clenched. Adrian did not flinch, nor did he look at the Duke. He remained focused on Eliza, his expression a mask of cold, indifferent steel. "She is no longer your property, Alistair," Adrian said, his voice low and vibrating with a frequency that made the crystal chandeliers above them hum. The Duke's face turned a mottled purple as he realized his guards were backing away, their eyes fixed on the royal embroidery on Adrian's collar. "She is my daughter, I disowned her. She leaves this house with nothing but the filth she chose," Alistair roared, but his voice lacked its usual bite. She leaves this house with the protection of the crown, Adrian countered, finally turning his gaze toward the Duke. The look in his eyes wasn't anger, it was the absolute certainty of a man who had already decided how and when his enemy would fall. Alistair flinched as if he had been struck, his mind racing to calculate the shift in the room's power dynamics as his friends among the gentry began to whisper. He tried to project strength, but his hands were shaking, the frantic realization dawning on him that he had just insulted a man who didn't need a sword to ruin him. The silence that followed was even more suffocating than the Duke's shouting, as the reality of the situation took hold. By claiming Eliza publicly with a royal seal, Adrian hadn't just saved her, he had declared war on the existing alliances of the southern duchies. The Earl of Marchmont, the lecherous man Eliza was supposed to marry, stepped out of the shadows, his eyes narrowed with a venomous greed. "You realize what this means, soldier," the Earl hissed. "The king's youngest son cannot simply pluck a disowned girl from the mud without breaking the Treaty of Valmont. The price of Eliza's freedom was the stability of the entire province, a cost that would be measured in blood and broken trade routes. Every noble in the room was now an enemy, their own fortunes tied to the Duke's favor and the Earl's gold. If Adrian took her through those doors, he was abandoning his incognito status and dragging the crown into a domestic scandal that could trigger a civil uprising." Eliza saw the flicker of calculation in the eyes of the men around her. They wouldn't let her leave quietly, and they wouldn't let Adrian survive the night if they could help it. Duke Alistair saw the opening and leaned in, his voice a poisonous whisper that carried to every ear in the ballroom. "You think that ring makes you untouchable, in this house, in this county. I am the law until the king himself stands on this marble." He raised a hand, and the sound of dozens of flintlock pistols being cocked echoed from the darkened gallery above the ballroom. The Duke's desperate gamble was clear. He would rather turn his ballroom into a slaughterhouse than let his bargaining chip walk out with a prince. "Give me the ring, Eliza," her father commanded, his eyes gleaming with a manic final madness. "Give it back, or I will ensure neither of you lives to see the sunrise, and the history books will say you died in a tragic fire." Eliza looked from her father's trembling gun hand to Adrian's calm, unmoving face, the cold rain still lashing against her back. The choice wasn't between poverty and wealth anymore, it was between a quick death and a war that would burn the kingdom to ash. The ballroom doors remained shattered, a gaping wound in the side of the Ravenscroft estate that let the freezing gale howl through the ranks of the elite. Duke Alistair stood frozen, his hand still raised in a silent command to the unseen gunmen in the shadows above. The clicking of the flintlock hammers had been the only sound to challenge the thunder, leaving a ringing silence that tasted of gunpowder and impending death. Eliza felt the eyes of the gentry burning into her, not with the pity one gives a fallen lady, but with the predatory hunger of those watching a sacrifice. No one stepped forward to help her up. Instead, the guests shuffled backward, drawing their expensive silks away from the splash of the mud she had carried into the room. The prince's hand remained extended, but to Eliza, it looked less like an escape and more like a tether to a different kind of destruction. She could feel the vibration of the Duke's suppressed rage shaking the floorboards beneath her knees, a silent promise of the violence to come. Every face she had known since childhood was now a mask of cold hostility, their loyalty bought and paid for by her father's crumbling treasury. She was a stain on the marble, a broken thing that the high society of Ravenscroft was already purging from its memory. Even with a royal signet ring in her palm, she felt the phantom weight of the shackles her father had spent 18 years forging for her. The transition from lady to outcast felt like a physical amputation, a visceral severing of everything she had used to define her existence. As she gripped Adrian's hand, she didn't feel the rush of romantic victory. She felt the terrifying void of a woman who had just become a fugitive. The manor behind her wasn't just a house. It was the only world she knew, and every step away from its warmth was a step into a life where she was a target. She looked at Adrian, the man she thought was a simple soldier, and felt a jagged shard of betrayal pierce her chest. If he had hidden a crown beneath his armor, what other secrets were waiting to devour her in the dark? The kindness he offered felt heavy, laden with the inevitable price that comes when a prince stoops to pick up a girl from the dirt. She wondered if he saw her as a person or merely as a weapon to use against a duke who had finally overstepped his bounds. The social death she had just endured was permanent. There was no version of the future where she returned to these halls as anything other than a scandal. Her reputation was a charred ruin, and the fear of what Adrian expected in return for his protection began to gnaw at her. She was a displaced soul, caught between a father who wanted her dead and a savior who had been a stranger all along. Duke Alistair's face contorted, the purple hue of his skin deepening as he realized his gunmen were hesitating under the prince's steady, glacial gaze. "You think you can just walk out?" the duke hissed, his voice cracking with the strain of his fading authority. "You are stealing property of this estate, and I will have the High Court strip that uniform off your back for this insolence." Adrian didn't even turn his head, his focus remaining entirely on Eliza as he pulled her gently but firmly toward the storm. The duke took a jagged step forward, his fingers twitching toward the decorative sword at his hip, a desperate glint in his eyes. "I will burn every bridge to the capital before I let a nameless whelp humiliate me in my own hall," he screamed over the rising wind. Adrian finally stopped, his silhouette framed by a sudden flash of lightning that turned the ballroom into a strobe light of white and black. "You have no bridges left, Alistair," Adrian said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to command the very thunder. "You have only the debt you owe the crown, and I am here to ensure you pay it in full." The air in the room grew thin as the hidden gunmen realized they were being asked to fire upon a member of the Blood Royal. If a single trigger was pulled, the Ravenscroft line wouldn't just be disowned, it would be hunted to extinction by the King's Iron Guard. The Duke's chest heaved as he calculated the odds, his mind a frantic mess of greed and survival instincts. He knew he couldn't kill a prince here, but he also knew that letting them leave meant the end of his reign. His glare followed them like a curse, a silent vow that if he couldn't own Eliza, he would ensure the world she entered was filled with thorns. But the cost of this defiance was already manifesting in the shifting whispers of the lords and ladies along the walls. Alliances that had stood for generations began to fracture as the guests realized the Duke was no longer the apex predator in the room. By choosing a girl who had been publicly stripped of her status, Adrian was dragging the royal family into a mire of provincial politics and blood feuds. The Treaty of Valmont, the very fabric that kept the southern duchies from civil war, was now a tattered rag. Punishment wouldn't just come for the Duke, it would come for the prince who had broken protocol for the sake of a disowned daughter. The political fallout would be a tidal wave, drowning the small amount of peace Eliza had hoped to find in her new life. Every step they took toward the waiting carriage was a step toward a battlefield where the weapons were laws, secrets, and cold steel. The scandal would follow them like a plague, ensuring that no door in the kingdom would truly be open to a princess who had been dragged through the mud. The carriage door slammed shut, cutting off the Duke's final, incoherent screams of rage as the horses reared against the rain. As the wheels churned the soaked earth of the driveway, Eliza looked through the glass, seeing her father standing on the porch, a small, receding figure of hate. Adrian sat opposite her, his face hidden in the shadows of the cabin, the golden crest on his chest glowing faintly in the dark. He didn't offer her words of comfort, he simply watched the manor lights disappear into the deluge. He leaned forward, his eyes catching a stray beam of moonlight as he looked back at the fortress of his enemy. "He thinks he has taken everything from you," Adrian whispered, the promise in his voice colder than the ice forming on the windows. "But he has only succeeded in making himself a beggar in the eyes of the throne." Eliza shivered, realizing that the man beside her was already planning the Duke's total erasure from the history of the realm. The carriage hit a deep rut, jarring her against the seat as the forest closed in around them, swallowing the road to the capital. The storm wasn't ending, it was merely the beginning of a much larger darkness that was already moving to meet them. Back at the manor, a rider was already slipping out of the stables, carrying a message to the Earl of Marchmont that would change the nature of the hunt. The Duke wasn't going to wait for the law, he was calling in the debts of men who specialized in making royalty disappear. As the first mile marker passed, Eliza realized that the signet ring wasn't a shield, it was a target painted directly onto her heart. The heavy silence of the royal court was far more deafening than the Duke's previous roars. As Alistair Ravenscroft stood in the center of the gilded hall, 3 years after casting his daughter into the mud, he realized the air had grown thin. The lords who once clamored for his favor now turned their backs with practiced precision, their whispers cutting through the room like serrated blades. He adjusted his doublet, but the fabric felt frayed, a bitter reminder of the silk he had once torn from Eliza's back. Not a single head bowed as he passed, only eyes that tracked his descent with the cold curiosity one reserves for a dying beast. The fear in the room was palpable, but it wasn't directed at the Duke anymore. It was the fear of being seen with him, a social contagion that had stripped Alistair of his armor more effectively than any blade. He reached for his pocket watch, a gold heirloom of the Ravenscroft line, only to find the chain empty, pawned weeks ago to pay for a carriage he could no longer afford to keep. The realization that he was a ghost in his own circles sent a tremor through his hands that no amount of pride could steady. Every footstep he took echoed with the hollowness of a man who had traded his blood for a crown that was now being melted down before his eyes. Inside Eliza's mind, the transition from a discarded daughter to a woman of the shadows had left deep, jagged scars. She stood on a balcony overlooking the capital, but she did not feel like the princess the public whispered about. The name, Ravenscroft, felt like a brand on her skin, a mark of shame that no amount of royal perfume could ever fully mask. She looked at her hands, still expecting to see the stains of the mud from that fateful night, wondering if she had truly escaped or if she was simply a more expensive prisoner now. The kindness Adrian showed her was a constant source of quiet agony, a debt she felt she could never truly repay. She often found herself waking in the middle of the night, convinced the Duke's guards were coming to drag her back to the cellar. Every gift from Adrian felt like a trap, a golden link in a chain that bound her to a destiny she had never asked for. If the world found out she was the common princess, the scandal would not just destroy her, it would pull Adrian from his throne. She didn't trust the peace they had built, waiting for the moment the king would tire of the embarrassment and cast her back into the rain. The fear of the consequences of her love was a shadow that followed her even into the brightest ballrooms. Alistair slammed his fist onto the mahogany table in his nearly empty study, the vibration rattling the few remaining crystal decanters. "The investments in the East are gone, all of them," he hissed at his solicitor, who wouldn't even meet his gaze. The man merely nodded, sliding a stack of foreclosure notices across the desk with the clinical indifference of a funeral director. The Duke's calculation had failed. He had bet on the king's favor returning once the scandal faded, but the silence from the palace had been absolute. He realized now that Adrian hadn't just taken his daughter, he had systematically severed every financial artery the Ravenscroft estate possessed. "I will see him hang for this," Alistair whispered, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a manic, desperate light. He paced the room, his boots scuffing the floorboards where the expensive rugs used to lay, his mind spinning a web of vengeance that grew more tangled by the second. He knew the prince was calm, tucked away in his fortress of protocol, and that very composure was an insult Alistair couldn't endure. A threat hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. If the Duke was to lose his legacy, he would ensure the prince lost his head. There was no victory yet, only the slow, grinding friction of two powers preparing for a final, catastrophic collision. The cost of Adrian's devotion was becoming a ledger of ruin that Eliza could no longer ignore. By shielding her, Adrian had fractured the High Council, turning ancient allies into bitter rivals who saw his marriage as an act of treason against the bloodline. The trade unions were restless, whispered to be funded by the Duke's remaining hidden coffers, and every gala was an exercise in avoiding an assassin's blade. The alliances that had held the kingdom together for a century were snapping like dry twigs under the weight of this singular romantic defiance. Punishment was coming, not just in the form of social exile, but in a systematic dismantling of the prince's political standing. The king had already hinted that the succession was no longer secure. a warning that echoed through the halls of the capital like a funeral knell. If Eliza remained by his side, she would be the woman who brought down a dynasty, the catalyst for a civil war that neither side could afford. Every public appearance was a gamble, a test of the public's fleeting loyalty that grew more dangerous with every passing week. The scandal had moved beyond the tea rooms and into the barracks, where soldiers whispered about a prince who preferred a beggar's hand over a crown's duty. The price of their love was being measured in the stability of a nation, and the bill was coming due. A knock at the Duke's door at midnight signaled the arrival of a figure shrouded in a heavy traveling cloak. Alistair didn't ask for a name. He only looked at the parchment the stranger carried, sealed with a crest that shouldn't exist. "The Earl of Marchmont says the trap is set," the stranger whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. The Duke's face contorted into a smile that held no warmth, a jagged expression of pure, unadulterated malice. He looked at the final foreclosure notice on his desk and tore it in half, the sound a sharp, final crack in the quiet room. "Tell the Earl that the common princess will have a homecoming she will never forget," Alistair commanded, his voice trembling with a terrifying new energy. The ultimatum was clear. Eliza would return to the Ravenscroft estate by the month's end, or the Duke would release the proof that Adrian had forged the royal decree to save her. If that secret was revealed, the prince would be stripped of his title, and Eliza would be executed for conspiracy against the crown. The hunt was no longer a matter of pride. It was a race toward a gallows that Alistair was more than happy to build with his own hands. The shadow of the daughter he threw away was finally long enough to cover them all in darkness. The announcement of the Royal Audit cut through the stagnant air of the Ravenscroft estate like a guillotine's blade. Duke Alistair stood in his drafty entrance hall, clutching a parchment sealed with the king's own wax, his breath hitching in a throat tightened by sheer terror. Around him, the few servants who hadn't yet fled stood like statues of salt, their eyes downcast to avoid the sight of their master's trembling hands. The once grand foyer was a tomb of memories, the silence so absolute that the scratching of a single rat behind the wainscoting sounded like a thunderclap. Alistair felt the phantom weight of the crown he had chased slipping through his fingers, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of a debtor's cell. His knees buckled slightly, a physical surrender that he quickly masked by leaning heavily against a marble pillar that was already being appraised for auction. The stares of his remaining staff weren't filled with loyalty, but with the quiet, judgmental observation of vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. He saw his own reflection in a cracked mirror, a man aged a decade in 3 years, his eyes sunken into hollow pits of desperation. The Iron Duke was now a man of glass, and the impending arrival of the High Envoy was the stone that would shatter him forever. He didn't feel like a nobleman anymore. He felt like a criminal awaiting the final reading of his sentence. Inside Eliza's mind, the news of the audit was a cold tide that threatened to drown the fragile life she had built in the capital. She sat in her dressing room, staring at the royal signet ring on her finger, but she saw only the face of the father who had cursed her in the rain. The title of High Env was a mask, a shadow play designed to lure her back to the very place where her soul had been broken. She feared that the king's sudden interest in the southern debts was not an act of mercy, but a calculated move to expose her husband's secret defiance once and for all. If the audit revealed that Adrian had diverted royal funds to keep the Ravenscroft name from total extinction, they would both face the gallows for high treason. Every kind word Adrian whispered to her now felt like a goodbye, a lingering sweetness before a bitter execution. She distrusted the sudden silence of the court, wondering if the gentry were simply sharpening their knives in the dark while she played at being a princess. The consequence of her return to the south was a risk that made her blood run cold. She was the bait in a trap she had helped build with her own longing. She felt her identity as a Ravenscroft pulling her back toward the mud, a gravitational force that no amount of royal silk could ever truly overcome. Her heart was a battlefield where hope fought a losing war against the deep-seated trauma of her birthright. Alistair paced the length of his study, his boots clicking on the bare floorboards as he stared at the mountain of debt ledgers piled on his desk. "The envoy will be here by sunset," he hissed to the empty room, his voice a jagged rasp of calculated malice. He knew this was his last chance to keep his head, and he began to weave a desperate plan to blackmail the crown using the very secrets he had hoarded like a miser. He would present the envoy with a choice: settle the Ravenscroft debts in full, or face the public revelation of the prince's forged decrees. There was no room for mercy in his heart, only a cold, mechanical drive to survive at the expense of the daughter he had already sacrificed once. He adjusted his tattered doublet, a frantic energy lighting up his eyes as he imagined the look on the envoy's face when the trap was sprung. The Duke wasn't just planning to save his estate, he was planning to regain his seat at the king's right hand by holding the monarchy's reputation hostage. He looked at the portrait of his late wife, the woman Eliza supposedly resembled, and felt only a surge of contempt for the weakness of her bloodline. If the envoy proved difficult, Alistair was prepared to burn the southern duchies to the ground just to see the sparks fly. He remained a dangerous animal backed into a corner, his fangs bared at a world that had dared to forget his name. The cost of this audit was a social and political price that Adrian had warned Eliza would be the ultimate test of their union. By sending a high envoy to the south, the king was effectively declaring martial law over the economy, a move that would break every remaining alliance between the crown and the provincial lords. If Eliza accompanied the env, she would be seen as the face of the king's tyranny, a symbol of the common princess coming to collect the gold of the suffering gentry. The punishment for such a move would be a total ostracization that would turn the entire kingdom against her husband's claim to the throne. Alliances that had stood for 3 centuries would snap overnight, leaving Adrian isolated and vulnerable to the Earl of Marchmont's growing rebellion. The scandal would no longer be a matter of marriage, it would be a matter of survival for every noble family whose debts were now under the royal microscope. Eliza realized that by trying to save her father's legacy, she might be handing the king the rope to hang her husband. The audit was a double-edged sword that could cut the Ravenscroft name from the history books or sever the prince's head from his shoulders. Every noble in the south was now an enemy with a vested interest in seeing the envoy fail, and the cost of failure was a civil war that would start at the manor's very gates. She was stepping into a furnace, and she knew that only one of them would emerge without being turned to ash. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the overgrown gardens of the Ravenscroft estate. A black carriage with no markings pulled into the courtyard, its wheels crunching on the gravel with a sound like grinding teeth. Alistair stood on the porch, a torch in his hand, his face a mask of predatory expectation as the door of the carriage slowly opened. A figure stepped out, shrouded in a heavy traveling cloak, but it was the flash of a familiar silver locket at the throat that made the Duke's heart stop. It wasn't just a royal representative who had arrived to settle the debts. It was the ghost of the girl he had discarded, now carrying the king's ultimate authority. "The audit begins tonight, father," a voice whispered from beneath the hood, cold and clear as a winter's night. Alistair's torch flickered and died, leaving them in a darkness that felt like a physical weight. The ultimatum was unspoken but absolute. He would bow to the daughter he hated, or he would watch his entire world be erased before the moon reached its zenith. A second carriage appeared at the gates, filled with the king's iron guard, their armor gleaming with a lethal, unforgiving light. The hunt had come home, and the Duke realized with a jolt of pure terror that he wasn't the hunter anymore. The shimmering white carriage pulled into the gravel drive of the Ravenscroft estate, its ivory panels reflecting the dying sun like a polished bone. Duke Alistair stood on the portico, his chest heaving under a suit of charcoal velvet that was 2 years out of fashion and tight around the ribs. The silence in the courtyard was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the cooling carriage wheels and the heavy breathing of the skeletal footmen. Alistair's hands trembled as he adjusted his cuffs, his eyes darting to the shadowed windows of the vehicle. He felt the weight of every unpaid debt pressing down on his shoulders, a physical burden that made his knees ache with the ghost of a coming beau. The few remaining servants peered through the cracked upper windows, their faces pale masks of voyeuristic dread. No one cheered the arrival of the king's env. The air was too thick with the scent of a dying era and the damp rot of the manor's foundation. Alistair tried to summon his old roar, but his throat felt as though it were filled with dry ash. He watched the carriage door handle turn, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to stretch the seconds into minutes. The Duke realized that for the first time in his life, he was not the architect of the moment, but merely a bit player in a play he hadn't written. Inside Eliza's mind, the sight of the Ravenscroft crest over the door triggered a visceral surge of nausea that no royal training could suppress. She sat in the velvet interior of the carriage, her fingers digging into the lace of purity that adorned her pristine white gown. The scent of the damp southern earth brought back the memory of her face pressed into the mud, the cold rain, and her father's laughter. She was no longer just Eliza. She was the king's high envy, yet she felt like a fraud draped in stolen jewels. The identity she had forged in the capital felt like a thin veil, ready to be torn away by a single word from the man waiting on the steps. She feared that the moment she stepped out, the common princess would vanish, leaving only the disowned girl who had failed to be a proper daughter. Every heartbeat was a drum of anxiety, warning her that the consequences of this confrontation would be written in the blood of her husband's reputation. She distrusted the sudden, heavy silence of the manor, wondering if her father had already prepared a gallows behind the rose bushes. The kindness Adrian had shown by giving her this authority felt like a heavy crown she wasn't strong enough to wear. She was a woman returning to the scene of her murder, unsure if she was the ghost or the executioner. Alistair stepped forward as the carriage door swung open, his face contorted into a grotesque mask of practiced charm and desperate hope. "Welcome to Ravenscroft Envy," he called out, his voice cracking with a high, unnatural pitch that betrayed his inner panic. He had rehearsed his speech for hours, a calculated blend of humility and historical grandeur designed to dazzle a royal bureaucrat. But as the figure stepped onto the gravel, the Duke's words died in his throat, replaced by a soft, wheezing sound of pure, unadulterated shock. He saw the shimmering white lace, the upright posture, and the cold, indifferent tilt of a head he had once tried to break. The prince stepped out behind her, his navy and gold military uniform acting as a vertical anchor of authority that made the Duke feel small and tattered. Adrian did not offer a greeting, he merely stood with his hands behind his back, his eyes scanning the ruin of the estate with a silent, devastating judgment. Alistair's calculation shattered instantly, replaced by a frantic, unspoken threat that pulsed in the air between them. He realized that the envoy was not a stranger to be bribed, but the very witness to his greatest sin, now returned with the power of life and death. The Duke's charm evaporated, leaving behind a raw, naked anger that made his visions swim with red sparks of defiance. The cost of this hierarchy inversion was a scandal that began to bleed out into the surrounding countryside the moment the carriage stopped. By allowing Eliza to act as the high envoy, the prince had effectively declared the southern gentry's laws null and void. The local lords, hiding in the tree line, watched as their leader was forced to stand below a woman he had cast out like refuse. Alliances that had anchored the Ravenscroft name to the southern soil for 5 centuries were dissolving in the heat of this public humiliation. Punishment was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical presence, manifested in the cold steel of the prince's gaze and the legal scrolls Eliza held. Every noble family in the province would soon have to choose between a dying duke and a princess who remembered every insult they had ever whispered. The political price of this mission was the total destabilization of the king's southern border, a move that the Earl of Marchmont was already preparing to exploit. If Eliza faltered, she would be the catalyst for a rebellion that would burn her husband's crown to a cinder. The restoration of her honor was being bought with the safety of the entire realm, a price that felt increasingly too high to pay. She saw the shadows moving in the woods and knew that the night was filled with eyes that wanted her dead before the sun rose. Alistair regained a sliver of his composure, leaning in close to Eliza as the prince moved to inspect the carriage. "You think a white dress changes the blood in your veins, girl?" he hissed, the scent of stale brandy and desperation rolling off him in waves. He didn't wait for her to answer, his eyes darting to the black wax seal on the central scroll she carried. "The Earl of Marchmont has 300 men-at-arms within a mile of this house, and they don't answer to the king." The Duke's ultimatum was a jagged blade pressed against the throat of the evening. She would sign over the Royal Audit's findings to him, or the manor would become a tomb for everyone inside. "The prince will never leave this valley alive if you break the seal on that scroll," Alistair whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, manic certainty. Eliza looked at her father, seeing the total ego death in his bulging eyes, and realized he was no longer a man. He was a cornered beast ready to kill its own kin. The danger hadn't ended with the arrival of the carriage. It had only just found its target in the heart of the Ravenscroft halls. Behind her, the prince's hand moved to the hilt of his sword as a low whistle echoed from the darkened gardens, signaling the closing of a trap 3 years in the making. The audit had begun, but the price of the first entry was the life of the man she loved. The heavy double doors of the great hall creaked open, admitting a draught that smelled of ozone and damp earth. Duke Alistair stood paralyzed at the foot of the dais, his breath hitching as the shimmering figure stepped into the light of the dying hearth. The few creditors and servants remaining in the room fell into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight against the lungs. No one bowed, but every head tilted in a synchronized flinch of recognition that sent a ripple of pure, unadulterated terror through the Duke's chest. The High Envy was no longer a faceless agent of the crown, but the very daughter he had discarded like a broken toy. Alistair's hands twitched at his sides, his fingers clawing at the air as if trying to find a grip on a reality that was rapidly dissolving. The stares of the onlookers weren't filled with the loyalty he had once commanded, but with a sharp, voyeuristic hunger for his total collapse. He felt the phantom sting of the mud he had once forced her into, now mirrored in the cold, crystalline light reflecting off her royal jewels. This wasn't a reunion, it was a reckoning, and the Duke realized with a jolt of nausea that he was the only one in the room without a weapon. His status, his pride, and his very name seemed to evaporate in the heat of the silence that followed her first step onto the marble. Inside Eliza's mind, the transition from exile to executioner was a jagged, painful process that felt like glass grinding against bone. She looked at the peeling wallpaper and the tarnished silver, seeing the skeleton of a world that had once been her entire universe. The lace of purity against her skin felt like a heavy shroud, a costume she had donned to hide the girl who still wanted to scream for her father's mercy. She wasn't just Lady Eliza anymore, but she didn't feel like a princess. She felt like a hollow vessel carrying a king's vengeance. Every jewel on her throat was a cold reminder of the price Adrian had paid to put her back in this room. She feared that the moment she spoke, her voice would betray her, revealing the terrified child who still lived behind her demure superiority. The consequences of this night were a dark tide rising around her ankles, threatening to pull her back into the abyss of her father's shadow. She distrusted the sudden, rigid stillness of the room, wondering if the shadows held more than just dust and memories. The kindness of the crown felt like a debt that was about to be called in with blood and bone. She was a woman standing on the ashes of her own identity, unsure if she was here to rebuild the Ravenscroft name or to salt the earth so nothing could ever grow again. Alistair's face contorted, the total ego death manifesting in a frantic, wide-eyed stare that darted between Eliza and the prince. "This is a farce. A disowned girl cannot hold the king's seal," he roared, but his voice cracked, losing its thunderous authority in the vast, empty space of the hall. He took a jagged step forward, his hand reaching for the empty space where his sword used to hang, a gesture of phantom power that only increased the room's collective pity. Adrian stepped into the light, his posture a contrast of control that made the Duke's frantic movements look like the flailing of a drowning man. The prince didn't speak. He simply let the weight of his presence act as a silent, lethal barrier between the father and the daughter. "The seal is real, Alistair, and so is the debt," Adrian finally said, his voice a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to vibrate the very crystals of the chandeliers. The Duke's calculation shifted from anger to a desperate, clawing survival instinct as he looked for a way to blackmail the woman he had once owned. He leaned in, his eyes rimmed with red, whispering a threat that was meant to pierce through the prince's calm. "If the king knew the common princess was meddling in the southern ledgers, he would have your head on a spike before the week is out." There was no victory in the room yet, only the sharp, electric tension of a standoff that was one wrong word away from a massacre. The cost of this revelation was a social explosion that would burn through the southern duchies before the sun reached its zenith. By revealing Eliza as the envy, the prince had officially broken the unspoken rule that kept the provincial lords from open rebellion. The Earl of Marchmont, watching from the gallery, gripped the railing so hard the wood groaned, his mind already spinning a web of treason. Alliances that had held the realm together for a generation were snapping like dry twigs, replaced by a cold, calculating desire to see the common princess fail. Punishment wouldn't just be a legal matter, it would be a total, systematic dismantling of everything the prince had built to protect her. The scandal was no longer a whisper in a tea room, but a loud, clanging bell that signaled the end of the king's internal peace. Every noble family whose debts Eliza now held would see her as a personal enemy, a beggar queen come to steal their ancestral lands. The prince's career as a military leader was effectively over, replaced by the role of a political pariah who had placed love above the stability of the throne. The price of Eliza, lace of purity, was the dirtying of every royal hand that had touched her, a stain that would never truly be washed away. She saw the calculation in the eyes of the creditors and knew that her husband's future was being traded for her moment of vindication. Alistair's laugh was a dry, rattling sound that held no joy, only the madness of a man who had seen the bottom of the abyss and decided to jump. He reached into his tattered doublet and pulled out a small, blackened scroll, holding it over the dying fire with a trembling hand. "You think you've won because you have a ring and a prince?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, conspiratorial whisper. The ultimatum was a jagged blade held against the throat of the morning. The Duke had the original marriage contract, the one that proved the prince had bypassed the High Council's veto. "If I drop this into the flames, the only proof of your legal union vanishes, and you become nothing more than a royal mistress to be discarded at the king's whim," Alistair commanded, his eyes glowing with a manic final light. He looked at Eliza, daring her to use the king's seal while he held the only thing that kept her from a life of permanent, public shame. The threat was a heavy, suffocating weight that made the air in the hall feel like lead, a dangerous question that demanded an answer Eliza wasn't sure she had. The prince's hand moved to his sword, but the Duke only leaned further over the embers, his face a mask of catastrophic realization and desperate, final malice. The reader must fear for the secret that could destroy the only hope Eliza has left. The Duke's hand froze over the dying embers, his fingers trembling so violently the blackened scroll rattled against his palm. The revelation of Eliza's status as envy had been a blow, but the sight of the man behind her was the killing strike to his sanity. Silence poured into the great hall like cold water, drowning the whispers of the creditors and the frantic breathing of the servants. Every eye was fixed on the navy and gold military uniform, a garment that carried the weight of 1,000 years of absolute rule. Alistair's jaw dropped, a thin string of saliva glistening in the firelight as his knees finally betrayed him, buckling until he struck the cold stone. The fear in the room shifted from a social anxiety to a primal, bone-deep terror that made the air feel like ice. This was no longer a domestic dispute or a debt collection. It was the sudden, violent arrival of the throne in a house of cards. The Duke looked up, his face a mask of catastrophic realization, seeing not a son-in-law, but the king's youngest son, Prince Adrian Valmont. The creditors who had been gloating moments ago now scrambled backward, their heels clicking frantically against the marble as they tried to vanish into the shadows. Alistair's world didn't just crumble, it turned to ash in the breath of a single, silent moment. Inside Eliza's mind, the shift in the room's gravity felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She stood in her shimmering lace, but the sight of Adrian in his full royal regalia made her feel more like an intruder than a wife. The soldier she had loved in the rain was gone, replaced by a stoic enforcer of the blood royal whose very presence demanded a total surrender of the soul. She looked at the Duke, the man who had raised her and then broken her, and felt a jagged shard of pity pierce through her desire for revenge. The identity she had clung to for 3 years, the wife of a common hero, was incinerated, leaving her standing in the shadow of a giant. She feared that the truth of Adrian's birth was a wall that would eventually rise between them, turning her into a political asset rather than a partner. The consequences of this reveal were already manifesting in the way the air felt, heavy with the expectation of a bloodletting that she couldn't stop. She distrusted the sudden, rigid subservience of the room, knowing that these same people would have spat on her an hour ago. The kindness of the prince now felt like a debt of a different kind, one that required her to be a perfect royal ornament in a court that hated her origins. She was a woman who had traded one master for a kingdom, and the price of that kingdom was the death of the life she had truly wanted. Alistair let out a low, whimpering sound, his total ego death complete as he stared at the gold tassels on Adrian's shoulders. "A prince," he whispered, the words sounding like a curse in the hollow space of the hall. "You let me throw a prince out into the mud." His mind raced with a frantic, desperate calculation, looking for any shred of leverage in a game where he was now the only pawn. He looked at the scroll in his hand, the marriage contract, and realized it was no longer a shield, but a death warrant for anyone who dared to touch it. The Duke's anger flared one last time, a flickering flame in a dying lamp, as he glared at the daughter who had brought this doom upon him. "You think this makes you a queen?" he hissed, his voice a jagged rasp that barely reached her ears over the crackle of the fire. Adrian stepped forward, his boots sounding like a funeral knell on the marble, his expression one of cold indifference that suggested the Duke was already a corpse in his eyes. There was no victory in the prince's gaze, only the methodical, surgical focus of a man who was here to erase a mistake from history. The power clash was silent and absolute, a vertical pillar of authority crushing a horizontal mess of greed and failure. The cost of this revelation was a scandal that would ripple through the empire's foundations before the morning tide. By revealing his true identity in the south, Adrian had bypassed the High Council's protocols, an act of defiance that the king's advisors would treat as a declaration of war. Alliances with the border lords, already fragile, would snap under the weight of this royal intervention in a private debt. Punishment wouldn't be limited to the Duke. The prince himself would face a trial by his peers for misleading the crown and the people. The choice to save Eliza was a choice to set the kingdom's political house on fire, a move that the Earl of Marchmont was already preparing to exploit for his own gain. Scandal was a dark cloud that would follow Eliza into every ballroom and every council chamber for the rest of her life. She was no longer just a disowned daughter. She was the woman for whom a prince had lied to his king and his country. Every noble family in the realm would see her as a threat to the natural order, a beggar princess who had seduced the throne into a state of chaos. The price of Adrian's shadow was the loss of the peace they had fought so hard to find in their 3 years of exile. She saw the fear in the eyes of the servants and knew that she was now a symbol of a revolution she never intended to start. The Duke's hand moved suddenly, not toward the fire, but toward the dagger hidden in the folds of his ruined velvet doublet. He wasn't aiming for the prince. His eyes were fixed on Eliza, a final, manic desire to destroy the beauty he could no longer control. "If I cannot have the Ravenscroft name," Alistair screamed, his voice breaking into a terrifying shriek, "then no one will." He lunged from his knees, the blade catching a stray gleam of firelight as he sought the heart of the daughter who had outshone his own life. The silence of the hall was shattered by the sound of a dozen swords leaving their scabbards as the prince's hidden guards moved like a single, lethal machine. Adrian's hand caught the Duke's wrist midair, the strength of the prince's grip audible as the bone groaned under the pressure. The ultimatum was a cold, sharp blade pressed against the Duke's throat before he could even register the failure of his strike. "You will not touch her again," Adrian whispered, his voice holding a promise of such absolute violence that the Duke's bladder finally failed him, a dark stain spreading on the expensive stone. The threat was no longer a matter of debt or honor. It was a matter of how many seconds the Duke had left to live before the prince's mercy ran out. The reader must fear that the Duke's madness will trigger a slaughter that no royal crest can ever truly stop. The Duke slumped onto the wet marble, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that sounded like dry leaves skittering over stone. The silence that followed his failed assassination attempt was more violent than the struggle itself. a suffocating vacuum that drew the air from every pair of lungs in the great hall. The creditors and minor nobles stood paralyzed, their faces drained of color, realizing they had just witnessed a peer of the realm attempt to murder a woman under the king's direct protection. No one moved to assist Alistair Ravenscroft as he struggled to maintain a shred of his tattered dignity while kneeling in the puddle of his own cowardice. Eliza stood perfectly still, her white lace stained with a spray of cold rainwater, her eyes fixed on the man who was both her father and her greatest enemy. She did not feel the rush of victory or the warmth of safety. She felt a terrifying, hollow numbness that seemed to freeze the marrow in her bones. The prince's hand was still clamped around the duke's wrist, a grip of iron that signaled a final, irreversible shift in the hierarchy of the world. Every servant in the hall stared not with sympathy, but with a visceral, wide-eyed fear that Eliza would now demand their lives as payment for their years of silent complicity. The room felt like a tomb that had been prematurely opened, exposing the rot of the Ravenscroft line to a light it was never meant to endure. Eliza gripped the silver locket at her throat, her knuckles white, feeling as though the walls were closing in to crush the girl she used to be. Inside Eliza's mind, the image of the Duke kneeling was a fracture in the very foundation of her reality, a sight so wrong it made her head swim with vertigo. She looked at the royal crest on Adrian's chest and saw not a shield, but a barrier that would forever separate her from the simplicity of the love she had once cherished. The peasant husband she had defended was a ghost, replaced by a sovereign whose power was so absolute it turned men into dust with a single glance. She feared that by accepting this rescue, she was signing away her right to ever be a person again, becoming instead a trophy in a game of high-stakes political chess. Every moment of kindness Adrian offered her now felt like a debt that would be paid in the currency of her own autonomy and the blood of those who opposed him. The distrust she felt was a jagged glass edge in her heart, cutting through the relief of the moment and replacing it with a cold, calculating dread. She wondered if Adrian had always intended for this public execution of her father's pride, or if she was merely the catalyst for a much older royal grudge. The consequences of this night would follow her into her dreams, a haunting reminder that her survival was built on the total destruction of her heritage. She was a woman without a country, caught between a father who hated her and a husband whose love carried the weight of a crown she never wanted to wear. Her identity was a tattered flag fluttering in the wind of a revolution that was only just beginning to burn through the southern provinces. Alistair looked up, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a manic, flickering defiance that refused to die even in the face of his ruin. "You cannot make me bow to a man who lived in my stables like an animal," he shrieked, his voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceiling like the cry of a wounded scavenger. He tried to pull his arm free, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hubris that made the onlookers flinch in collective embarrassment. Adrian didn't answer with words. Instead, he signaled to the High Envy's guard, who stepped forward and unrolled the central scroll, revealing the shimmering, embossed royal crest of the king. The wax seal was broken, and the decree was read with a clinical, lethal precision that stripped the Duke of his titles, his lands, and his very right to stand upright. "By the blood of the father and the will of the throne, you are a debtor to the crown and a traitor to the peace," Adrian whispered, his voice a low, vibrating hum of absolute authority. The Duke's calculation shifted one last time, a frantic, cornered look entering his eyes as he realized the only alternative to a bow was a gallows built in his own courtyard. He looked at the Earl of Marchmont, pleading for a sign of support, but the Earl merely looked away, already calculating how to distance himself from a sinking ship. The power clash reached its zenith as the prince leaned down, his face inches from the Duke, the unspoken threat of immediate execution hanging in the air like a sharpened blade. Alistair's pride finally snapped with an audible wet sob, his forehead beginning its slow, agonizing descent toward the cold, unforgiving stone of the hall. The cost of this forced submission was a social earthquake that would shatter the remaining alliances of the South before the dawn could break. By forcing a duke to kneel to a man he had once mocked as a peasant, the prince was upending the divine right of the nobility in a way that would never be forgotten or forgiven. The scandal would be whispered in every tavern and every courtly chamber, painting Eliza as the vengeful daughter who used a prince's bed to destroy her own father. Punishment would come in the form of a quiet, systematic boycott of the prince's interests, a war of shadows led by those who feared that their own heads might be next. The restoration of Eliza's honor was being purchased with the stability of the entire social order, a move that would turn the gentry into a pack of starving wolves. The punishment for such a public humiliation was a debt that would be collected in the blood of the prince's heirs and the tears of the woman he claimed to love. Alliances that had anchored the kingdom's economy were dissolving in real time as the lords realized the king was no longer playing by the old rules of mutual respect. Eliza saw the hatred simmering in the eyes of the minor nobles and knew that her time as a princess would be spent walking through a minefield of poisoned cups and hidden daggers. The price of the duke's bow was the permanent loss of any hope for a peaceful life, a transaction that felt increasingly like a tragedy disguised as a triumph. She stood in the center of the storm, realizing that the crown Adrian offered her was a target that would never be removed. The duke's forehead finally touched the marble with a sickening thud, a sound that signaled the total ego death of the Ravenscroft line. He stayed there, a broken heap of velvet and bitterness, while the prince stood over him like a god of the underworld claiming a soul. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the flickering torches seem to dim under the weight of the moment. Eliza looked down at her father's trembling shoulders and felt a cold, final severing of the last cord that bound her to this house and this man. The great bow was complete, but the room felt less like a hall of justice and more like a slaughterhouse where the only thing killed was the possibility of mercy. Adrian turned to the room, his voice ringing out with a cold, clear command that chilled the hearts of everyone present. The audit is concluded, and the sentence is passed. Let the world know that the Ravenscroft name is now a ward of the crown. But as he spoke, a distant, rhythmic thumping began to echo from the courtyard, the sound of hundreds of boots marching in unison toward the manor. A messenger burst through the side door, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as he collapsed at the foot of the dais. "The Earl of Marchmont has declared a state of secession," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the rising roar of the crowd outside. The ultimatum was no longer a matter of law, but of war. Eliza and the prince were now under siege in a house that was no longer a home, but a fortress of the dead. The roar of the mob outside the manor gates died into a chilling, expectant silence as the finality of the duke's fall settled over the great hall. Alistair Ravenscroft remained pressed against the cold marble, a broken man whose very presence now seemed to offend the air he breathed. The creditors and minor lords stood like statues of salt, their eyes flickering between the kneeling former master and the woman who now held the keys to their futures. No one moved to assist the duke as he finally began to push himself up, his movements slow and jerky, his face a mask of catastrophic realization. Eliza stood at the center of the room, the shimmering white of her gown a sharp, violent contrast to the dark rot of the hall, but her heart beat with a frantic, unearned terror. She did not feel like a victor. She felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own childhood, draped in jewels that felt like cold, heavy shackles. The stares of the servants were no longer filled with contempt, but with a terrifying, hollow subservience that made her skin crawl with the memory of her own helplessness. She looked at Adrian, his royal uniform gleaming under the chandeliers, and felt the sudden, crushing weight of a crown she had never asked to wear. The room was thick, with the scent of ozone and old dust, a suffocating atmosphere where the only thing more dangerous than the duke's hatred was the prince's absolute, unwavering protection. Eliza gripped the arms of the ducal chair, her knuckles white, wondering if she was truly ascending a throne or merely stepping into a more gilded cage. Inside Eliza's mind, the restoration of the Ravenscroft name felt like a bitter irony, a reconstruction built upon the scorched earth of her own identity. She was no longer the girl who had loved a common soldier in the rain, nor was she the daughter who had sought her father's approval. She was a Duchess-Regent, a title that felt like a foreign tongue in her mouth, a mask that hid the jagged scars of her public disowning. The fear of the consequences of this new reign was a dark tide rising in her soul, whispering that her father's blood still flowed in her veins, tainted by the same pride that had destroyed him. She looked at the signature on the royal decree and felt a sickening distrust of the power it granted her, wondering if she was becoming the very thing she had spent 3 years fleeing. Every gift Adrian offered, the titles, the lands, the soldiers, felt like a brick in a wall that would forever separate her from the world of the living. She feared that the people of the South would never see her as a savior, but as a royal puppet installed to drain their resources and punish their traditions. The memory of the mud was still fresh, a phantom stain on her soul that no amount of ducal authority could ever truly wash away. She was a woman without a past, standing on the edge of a future that required her to be as cold and calculated as the man who had abandoned her. The distrust she felt toward her own newfound status was a jagged blade, cutting through the relief of the moment and replacing it with a lingering, poisonous dread of the responsibilities to come. Alistair finally found his feet, his breath coming in jagged, wheezing gasps as he looked at the daughter who had just erased his entire existence with a stroke of a pen. "You think you can rule these lands? You are a girl playing at a man's game, and the wolves will have your throat before the month is out." He spat, his voice a tattered remains of its former glory. He took a staggering step toward her, his eyes rimmed with red, but the prince's hand moved to the hilt of his sword with a fluid, lethal grace that stopped the duke mid-stride. Adrian's expression remained one of cold indifference, a silent wall of royal steel that rendered the duke's threats as insignificant as the buzzing of a fly. Alistair's calculation shifted one last time, looking for a way to ruin the estate he could no longer own, but he found only the airtight legal trap Eliza had laid for him. "You will live out your days in the gardener's cottage at the edge of the woods, father," Eliza said, her voice a low, vibrating frequency that silenced the room. "You will have a roof, a bed, and the silence you once forced upon me, but you will never step foot on this marble again." The duke's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated humiliation, the realization that he was to be a beggar on his own land hitting him harder than any physical blow. There was no victory in Eliza's eyes, only a weary, surgical focus on the survival of the Ravenscroft name at the cost of her father's total erasure. The power clash ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating sound of a man being told he no longer existed in the eyes of the law. The cost of this new reign was a political and social debt that would be collected in the blood of the southern border for decades to come. By claiming the regency, Eliza had officially declared war on the ancient customs of the duchies, turning every noble family into a silent, simmering enemy of the crown. Alliances that had anchored the kingdom's stability were now tattered rags, replaced by a cold, calculating fear that the common duchess would next come for their ancestral lands. Punishment wouldn't be a legal decree, but a systematic, underground resistance led by the Earl of Marchmont, who saw Eliza's grace as a weakness to be exploited. The restoration of the Ravenscroft name was being bought with the safety of every village in the valley, a price that felt increasingly like a tragedy disguised as a triumph. The scandal of a disowned daughter returning as a regent would be the spark that ignited a fire across the kingdom's social orders, threatening to burn down the very concept of hereditary right. Every dinner party and every council meeting would be a minefield of poisoned whispers and hidden daggers, ensuring that Eliza would never know a moment of true peace. The prince's career was effectively over, his reputation as a soldier replaced by that of a romantic rebel who had destabilized a province for the sake of a girl's honor. The punishment for their love was a lifetime of political exile within their own palace, a constant battle to prove they were more than just a scandal wrapped in royal silk. She saw the hatred in the eyes of the minor lords and realized that the new reign was merely the first day of a long, exhausting siege. Eliza stepped onto the balcony, the royal crest glowing on the banner above her as she looked out over the darkened lands she now commanded. Below, the prince's guard was already leading the former duke toward the edge of the estate, his hunched figure disappearing into the long shadows of the trees. The manor was hers, but it felt like a hollow shell, filled with the ghosts of the family she had lost and the heavy, suffocating expectations of the family she had gained. She looked at Adrian, who stood in the shadows of the doorway, his eyes watching her with a pride that felt more like a burden than a blessing. The Ravenscroft name was restored, but the heart of the girl who had carried it was a landscape of ash and cold stone. The final outcome was a transformation that left Eliza standing as the Duchess-Regent, but as she watched the last of the mob disperse, a new threat emerged from the dark. A single rider approached the gates, carrying a torch that illuminated a banner she hadn't seen in years, the crest of the king's High Inquisitor. The ultimatum was a silent, terrifying promise. The king had approved the regency, but only on the condition that Eliza provide the original marriage contract within 48 hours. If the document her father had threatened to burn was truly gone, the regency would be void, and the prince would be charged with the kidnapping of a noble daughter. The reader must fear that the restoration of the name was merely a temporary reprieve before a much more final execution. If you felt the rush of justice as the Duke's pride finally hit the floor, give this story a thumbs up and let us know in the comments. Does blood really matter more than loyalty? Subscribe and hit the bell icon to ensure you never miss a moment where arrogant villains get exactly what they deserve, because in the world of the Ravenscrofts, karma always knows the address.